And that's where I'd like to bring in a man who might actually be able to answer that for us, NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine. Administrator, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. It's an honor. Appreciate it.
Now, we have a lot to talk about with 2018, but I first want to talk about the tribute that NASA published to the late President George H.W. Bush. Your statement was, quote, NASA and the nation mourn the passing of President George Herbert Walker Bush, a leader who was a passionate advocate for space exploration. Now, you share a kinship with the former president in that you were both naval aviators who flew in combat. So tell me a bit about what the 41st president meant to you and to our space program.
Yeah, so you know, I before I was the NASA administrator, I was in the House of Representatives, and you know, I had an interest in politics largely because of a speech that the former president gave in 1992. He talked about sitting on the deck of an aircraft carrier, looking at the stars and dreaming about a girl named Barbara. And of course, he was a World War II pilot. He had been shot down a couple of times, survived and continued to fight on behalf of his country. He leaves an amazing legacy. It had a big impact on my life going back to my days in high school, but not just on me personally, for our country. Now, as the NASA administrator, I can tell you that his legacy is still very alive and very well here at NASA. He initiated what was called the Space Exploration Initiative, which was a comprehensive vision for space to include a permanent presence of humans in low Earth orbit and a return to the moon for a permanent presence of humans on the surface of the moon with an eventual mission to Mars. Now that what was called at the time Space Station Freedom, which was a vision of George Herbert Walker Bush when he was president, Space Station Freedom, under his leadership, morphed into what is now the International Space Station with the collapse of the Soviet Union. President Bush had on his agenda an idea to bring the international community together on Space Station Freedom, call it the International Space Station, and actually bring Russia onto the International Space Station to the point where it would be a strong partnership for both countries. So President Bush had really an amazing legacy, not just as a Navy pilot and an aviator, but also of course, his career is just remarkable. It's unlike anything we've ever seen. But on top of it all, as the NASA administrator, I'm just tremendously grateful for his focus on space. He increased the NASA budget at a time when that wasn't something that was high on the agenda of many politicians. He wanted to do it. He believed it was important for our country to maintain its prestige, and so he did. And of course, he created the National Space Council as well, which of course put the head of all the different agencies of the federal government on a panel that said, how do we maximize the utility of space for the betterment of all humanity and the United States citizens? And he really had a heart for space and space exploration in general.
Now, back in October, you said about the current administration, apparently they do as well, you said, quote, this administration is very focused on space. These recent NASA successes sure seem to validate that statement, our 2018 successes. So tell us what the rover landing on Mars means for NASA and the nation. And then I want to talk about this landing on the asteroid Bennu.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you think about the Mars InSight lander, this is a mission that is going to help us understand the history of Mars. Here's what we know about Mars historically. It used to have a very thick atmosphere, and its northern hemisphere was 3/4 composed of ocean. It used to have a very strong magnetosphere that protected it from the radiation of deep space, which enabled it to have an ocean and a thick atmosphere. Something happened 3 billion years ago that changed all of that. And Mars took a very different path than the path that Earth took. My point is this: Mars was at one point in time habitable. In other words, it could have sustained life. We don't know that it did. We want to find out, but we don't know that it did. But we do believe 100% that it could have, based on its composition. At some point, it lost its magnetosphere. The radiation of deep space dried up its ocean and got rid of its thick atmosphere. It still has a thin atmosphere, mostly carbon dioxide. But the question is, what happened where Mars went from being habitable to not being habitable? And here's what we also need to understand today. We know now, because of recent missions, that Mars has polar ice caps. In other words, there's pure water ice at the poles of Mars. We also know that Mars has complex organic compounds on its surface, because of the Mars Curiosity rover. And we also know that the methane cycles of Mars are perfectly commensurate with the seasons of Mars. None of these things guarantee that there's life on Mars, but each of them increase the probability that life could exist on Mars. We also know that 10 kilometers below the surface of Mars, there's liquid water. 10 kilometers below the surface of Mars. The reason that's important is that would protect that water would be protected from the radiation of deep space because it's under the surface of Mars. So I think it's important that we, as an agency and our country, do everything possible to determine whether or not there could be life. I'm not talking about bunny rabbits or anything, but there could be microbial life on a planet that's not our own. And if we made that discovery, I think it would transform our perceptions of ourselves in the universe and what else could possibly be out there. NASA is making new discoveries every day as to the fact that there are planets, many planets now around almost every star, and we're discovering more and more all the time. We now know that there's more planets in our galaxy than there are stars in our galaxy, which is an amazing kind of development, and it makes us question what else is out there, and how do we learn more about our own environment.
Administrator, could you tell me very, very quickly, because we're running out of time, where you think NASA will be in 50 years? Will we go beyond Mars?
Well, first of all, I do believe in 50 years from now, we will have a permanent presence of humans in low Earth orbit and on the surface of the moon, which of course was George Herbert Walker Bush's vision, his space exploration initiative. We've seen that reinvigorated now with President Trump, who initiated Space Policy Directive 1, saying that he wants us to go back to the moon, this time to stay with international and commercial partners. And he wants us to utilize the resources of the moon. We now know that there's hundreds of billions of tons of water ice on the surface of the moon. Water ice on the moon represents air to breathe. It represents water to drink. So we're talking about life support. It also represents rocket fuel. Hydrogen and oxygen is in fact the same rocket fuel that powered the space shuttles and that will power the Space Launch System, the largest rocket ever built. So I do believe we're going to take all of these capabilities and technologies that the president is having us develop right now, and we're going to take them onto Mars with a sustainable architecture, not only at the moon, but 50 years from now, I think it's very realistic that we could have a presence of humans for the long term on the surface of Mars.
NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine, thank you very much for being here. Fascinating stuff, Administrator.
My honor.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to see more breaking news coverage, exclusive interviews, and great videos, click over here to our YouTube channel and subscribe. And don't forget to download the free Newsmax TV app. Newsmax TV, it's real news for real people.